Former UFC featherweight champion Jose Aldo has announced his retirement from mixed martial arts. Another legend of the sport has bowed out, and you could very well argue that Aldo was quite possibly the greatest featherweight to step foot in the UFC. A former two-time UFC featherweight champion, Aldo was the inaugural 145-pound champion the UFC ever crowned, and his first reign with the title saw him hold the featherweight championship for a total of 1,848 days. Aldo won the title in 2010 and he officially dropped it to Conor McGregor in their historic fight at UFC 194 in 2015. Now, there could be an argument that a lot of fans often tend to define Jose Aldo's career simply based on his 13-second loss to Conor McGregor. But you cannot define Aldo's career simply based on that loss to McGregor because he was much more of a bigger fighter than that. So, after an incredible run of performances in WEC, Aldo made his official UFC debut at UFC 129 in 2011, as he was promoted as the UFC featherweight champion. And believe it or not, Aldo's first 7 fights in the UFC were all successful title defenses as the featherweight champion. His first fight was a 5-round decision victory over Mark Hominick, and then he followed it up with notable wins over names such as Kenny Florian, Chad Mendes, Frankie Edgar, and even the Korean Zombie as well. So, with a resume like that, you could pretty much assume how great of a fighter Jose Aldo was in his prime in the featherweight division. I mean, 7 back-to-back title defenses just goes on to showcase how dominant he was as the UFC featherweight champion. But of course, after the loss to Conor McGregor in 2015, Aldo's confidence took a hit. And for a fighter who was dominating his division for years, for him to lose like that in that fashion must have been a challenging task to get back on track. However, in his next fight, Aldo fought Frankie Edgar in a rematch from UFC 156 and beat him once again via a unanimous decision to win the interim featherweight title, and he was later promoted as the undisputed UFC featherweight champion due to Conor McGregor's inactivity. But that must have left a bad taste in Aldo's mouth, because honestly, for a fighter of his caliber, he would have been hoping to avenge his loss to Conor and properly win the UFC featherweight title once again, and simply not get promoted as the undisputed champion to that spot by winning an interim championship. However, things sort of were looking good for Aldo at the time, but in order to right the wrong, he decided to fight another featherweight legend in the form of Max Holloway in his next fight in Brazil, in the main event of UFC 212. And this is where a loss really did not help Jose Aldo's case, as he lost to Max Holloway via a 3rd-round TKO and lost the UFC featherweight championship in front of his very own people. What followed next was a rematch against Holloway at UFC 218, and which Aldo lost as well. So he was in a really bad spot at that point, you could imagine, because not only did he lose to Holloway twice in a row to further add to his misery of his loss to Conor McGregor, but he also ended up losing the UFC featherweight championship twice. But Aldo once again bounced back from the face of adversity like he always did throughout his career and picked up a much needed and emotional victory over Jeremy Stephens via a 1st-round TKO finish in 2018. And the emotion on Aldo's face after that win pretty much explained what he was going through. Aldo would go on to compete just twice in the UFC's featherweight division after that win. A win over Renato Moicano followed next, but his next fight would go on to be his final featherweight fight of all time against the current UFC featherweight champion, Alexander Volkanovski. So you could say that it was a totally fitting manner to end Jose Aldo's UFC run at 145 by facing the man who is arguably the greatest UFC featherweight champion after Aldo himself. So of course, that brings me to the point of Jose Aldo's most memorable performance and his most memorable fight in the UFC's featherweight division. Going back to his prime years, I think Jose Aldo's win over Chad Mendes at UFC 42 was simply one of the best knockouts I had ever seen in this sport. The timing of that knee strike from Aldo that knocked out Mendes was absolutely insane. I mean, if you could just go back and watch that KO in real time, then just go ahead and do yourself a favor, because the way Aldo caught Mendes with that knee was absolutely insane. So that has to be like the most memorable Jose Aldo performance during his prime years in the UFC. In the later stages of his UFC featherweight run though, I think without a question it was Jose Aldo's victory over Jeremy Stephens that mattered the most, because at that point the Brazilian fighter was in such a crucial stage of his career at the time after those major losses to Conor McGregor and Max Holloway, and that was a much needed victory for him against Stephens. So I would say that the 2 fights which were like the most memorable performances of Jose Aldo during his featherweight run were of course his performances against Chad Mendes at UFC 142 and his 2018 win over Jeremy Stephens. What followed next was a move down to bantamweight division, and for someone who absolutely loves watching the UFC bantamweights like me, I think it was really great to see the veterans like Jose Aldo and Frankie Edgar move down to the 135-pound division because Aldo obviously offered so much to this division in such a short period of time. So he started off at UFC 245 with a very controversial loss to Marlon Moraes, and then in his next fight, the UFC sort of made a bad matchmaking decision by putting Aldo against one of the very dangerous bantamweights on the planet right now in the form of Peter Yan. And on top of that, the two men fought for the vacant UFC bantamweight championship. And as we thought it would, the plan really did backfire on the UFC, and it did quite badly as well, as Aldo was decimated by Peter Yan at UFC 251. At that point, you would really think that was the end of Jose Aldo's UFC career because that was such a devastating loss. And for a fighter who was in his mid-30s, for him to lose back-to-back fights after dropping down to the bantamweight division was like the worst possible start he could have asked for. However, that was not the end of Jose Aldo, and much like every other occasion, he bounced back in a big way with a win over Chito Marlon Vera. Aldo then followed up with a victory over Pedro Munoz, and I think it was the Munoz fight where he made a huge statement by letting everyone know that Jose Aldo was still a threat in this UFC's bantamweight division. Because that right there was such a clinical performance, and Aldo then carried on that momentum to secure a much needed victory over Rob Font, which for me has to be the best version of Jose Aldo we ever got in the bantamweight division. Aldo was untouchable in that fight, and he pretty much dominated Font in every single aspect, starting from round number 1 to round number 5. But it was Aldo's insane power, I think, that stood out the most in that fight. The way he dropped Font in that fight by connecting with just his knee just went on to prove how strong he was in that bout. As far as his bantamweight run is concerned, I would say that Jose Aldo's fight against Rob Font stood out the most and was the most dominant version of him at 135. I really did think that version of Aldo could have challenged for the bantamweight championship at one point, but once again, it is what it is. Nonetheless though, congratulations to Jose Aldo on closing out on an incredible career. As much as I would have loved to see him get one final win in his home country, I guess we will have to deal with another one of the OGs of the fight game retiring from the sport. But you guys can let me know in the comments what was your favorite Jose Aldo fight of all time in the UFC. Thanks for watching this video.